y sgwrs hon gyfrwng y Saesneg heno, cofiwch bod croeso chi gysylltu â ni yn y Gymraeg hefyd os yma fi'n cwestiwn neu i adael unrhyw sylw, adael sylw neu gysylltu â ni. Felly hoffwn ni nawr gyflwyno'n cyflwynydd heno, sef Susan Fielding. Mae Susan wedi bod gyda'r Comisiwn ers 2005 yn gweithio fel ymchwilydd Adeiladau Hanesyddol. Mae ganddi arbenigedd yn y defnydd o dechnolegau digidol ar gyfer arolygu a dehongli adeiladau hanesyddol, ac mae'n gyfrifol am ein prosiectau ymchwil thematig, sy'n cynnwys prosiect y Comisiwn i gofnodi, ymchwilio a dehongli Capeli Cymru. Mae gen Susan diddordeb brwd mewn addoldau ac mae'n ein cynrychioli ac yn ymwneud â sawl pwyllgor yn y maes yn cynnwys ar addoldau Cymru, gyda Capel, sef Cymdeithas Treftadaeth y Capeli, Cynllun Twristiaeth Ffydd, Fforwm Addoldau Hanesyddol a Chymru Cysegredig. Felly mae digon o arbenigedd ganddi yn y maes hwn heno. This evening's speaker, Susan Fielding, is our Senior Investigator for Historic Buildings, responsible for the Commission's thematic research project in relation to the historic built environment. She has a career-long interest in places of worship and has been involved in the Commission's chapels recording project for the last 13 years, managing it for the last 8 years. In addition to carrying out the recording, research and interpretation of these buildings, she sits on as an external advisor to Adeiladau Cymru, the Welsh Religious Building Trust, and sits on the Executive Committee of Capel, the Chapel's Heritage Society. And she's also been involved in various partnership boards and committees, including the Faith Tourism Action Plan, the Historic Places of Worship Forum, and Sacred Wales. With an expertise in the use of digital technologies for the survey and interpretation of historic buildings, Susan worked with Adeiladau Cymru on the Digital Descent project, creating a virtual museum of nonconformity, a project which involved the laser scanning of chapels held in trust by Adeiladau Cymru, and the creation of a series of innovative digital resources using 3D virtual reconstruction and the use of gaming technologies for the interpretation of these buildings and their stories. Felly dwi'n siŵr gan i glywed mwy am hyn yn y funud. Ac ar hynny eiriau, mae'n ei dosodd nawr i gyflwyniad Susan ar un o adeiladau mwyaf eiconig Cymru. Diolch.
Prynawn da, croeso, a diolch i pawb am ddod i'r sgwrs hon am Capeli Cymru, Pensaernïaeth Genedlaethol. Today I'm going to give an introduction to the Nonconformist Chapel in Wales and the work that the Royal Commission has been carrying out in regard to recording and understanding these buildings. We now recognise these as the architectural icon of 19th century Wales, described as the structures that make every Welsh settlement instantly recognisable as such, in a religious pluralism replicated in no other community in Europe, and the enormous variety that exists within chapel building and the principles of design that they incorporate are now recognised as equal with other great public buildings of the late 19th century. Conversely, they are also some of the buildings most at threat through closure leading to neglect, dereliction and demolition. Thomas Rees wrote in 1881, "The history of Protestant nonconformity in Wales is a subject so full of general interest that its study cannot fail to be of interest to the Christian, the patriot and the politician. A movement which in the course of 2 centuries resulted in the elevation of the Welsh from the depths of moral degradation, ignorance and superstition to the highest rank amongst the Protestant nations of the world deserves the thoughtful consideration of all thinking men." Despite this obvious commendation, the heritage world largely failed to recognise the historic importance of chapels until 1983, when the National Museum of Wales hosted an exhibition detailing 20 years of photography by an individual who had recognised the threat that they were facing, one Anthony Jones, which resulted in this publication by him, the first looking at chapels on a pan-Wales scale. This was the first time that chapel heritage had really been seen as deserving of consideration by a national organisation, bringing the plight of these buildings to the fore and leading to a national report which asked questions about what Wales was doing to combat the fact that a national architecture was disappearing as congregations dwindled and buildings closed. The last time chapel buildings had been audited was in 1905, when the snappily titled Royal Commission on the Church of Wales and Other Religious Buildings in Wales and Monmouthshire had carried out a survey asking for every place of worship for details about membership, capacity, the value of their buildings and language, amongst other things. By the early 1990s, neither the denominations or the heritage sector really had any idea of how many chapels there were in Wales, let alone any understanding of the architects who had built them, their design and form, or any denomination or geographical variations, for instance. At this point, the Royal Commission and Capel, the Chapel's Heritage Society, launched a project to compile basic information and, where possible, a photographic record for each of the nonconformist chapels that had existed in Wales at one time or another, with more intensive records of those buildings considered to be of particular architectural, historic or religious significance, at the heart of which has been a database. An example entry for Capeli Ymchwilydd you can see here. The project has so far identified some 6,500 chapel sites across Wales. These include sites where the chapel was built at least once, with some being rebuilt up to 4 times in their history, taking the number of individual buildings that congregations raised money and resources for to just fewer than 10,000. One of the most common criticisms that we hear of chapel building is the fact that they all look the same, and it is this supposed uniformity which fuels the belief that widespread preservation isn't necessary, another being that they are not proper architecture. Unsurprisingly, considering the numbers, we have revealed a wealth of variety in size, architectural style and complexity, ranging from the exceedingly simple to the most imposing and ornate, and from those which were designed by professional architects using the latest architectural fashions to those that were crafted by the communities which they served. My main focus today is the buildings, and I'm afraid I don't have time to go into detailed histories about the different dissenting denominations in Wales, a subject which would be an entire series of lectures in its own right. The earliest causes to make their mark in Wales, however, were the Independents and the Baptists, the first independent congregation being formally incorporated at Llanfech, Monmouthshire in 1639, while the Baptists established themselves at Ilston near Swansea in 1649. These early congregations, who in this time of political and religious turbulence often met with persecution, met in private houses, barns, public houses, or in the open air. This changed when the Act of Toleration in 1689 allowed dissenters to meet legally, and for the first time it became possible to erect custom-built chapels for nonconformist use. Because of the desire of congregations to go on to build bigger and more elaborate chapels as time and money allowed, few of these 17th and 18th century chapels survive in their original forms. Both denominations grew steadily during the 18th century, with notable figures such as Christmas Evans, whose inspiring sermons earned him the title the Bunyan of Wales, bringing Baptist numbers up to 9,000 members by 1800, while independent ministers numbered 28 in the south and 18 in the north. A strong Unitarian base developed, which flourished within 2 clusters in South Ceredigion, as Smotyn Dee, and around Aberdare, Glamorgan. The religious landscape of Wales was truly transformed, however, by the coming of Methodism in the mid-18th century, with its emphasis on intense personal devotion, nurtured by the preaching of yw'r, the word. The 2 leading lights of Welsh Methodism were Howell Harris and Daniel Rowland, both of whom embraced the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, which taught that salvation was open only to the elect, those few who were pre-chosen by God from the beginning of time. Although a view shared in England by Methodist leader George Whitefield, it was in direct opposition to the teachings of John Wesley, who preached that the offer of salvation was open to all who embraced God's invitation to faith, and this led to an early and decisive split in Welsh Methodism. John Wesley's inability to speak Welsh severely impacted on the early growth of Wesleyan Methodism, with only around 600 followers by 1800. In comparison, the Calvinistic Methodists had established over 200 chapels, with concentrations in Welsh-speaking areas such as Ceredigion, Carnarvonshire and Anglesey. The Wesleyans would remain the fourth largest denomination in Wales, while Calvinistic Methodism would go on to be the largest and most defining force in Welsh nonconformity by the end of the 19th century. The earliest surviving chapel in Wales is Mae'r in Radnorshire, an independent place of worship dating to 1691 or 1692, and is typical of a meeting house that was once common, being a conversion from a farm building. A rare survival caused by its small congregation and lack of funds which prevented rebuilding. There are a small number of descriptions which evoke similar designs, such as the Baptist chapel at Hen Goed Glamorgan, described as resembling a square dwelling house, whitewashed prettily and having a large window in the centre of the front wall, or Capel y Cwar Clydach Glamorgan, built in 1794 for the Baptists, where externally the chapel was of simple design with a thatched roof, and within it had narrow wooden benches for people to sit and a pulpit on the central position on the side wall, which corresponds with the interior of Mae'r that we see in this photograph. Two other notable early chapels are Hen Gapel Nanhoron, Carnarvonshire, 1770 to 1772, and Capel Penrhw Drefach Flindre, Carmarthenshire, dated 1777, and now at St Fagans National Museum of History. While the interiors of these 18th century examples provide a level of refinement superior to Mae'r, complete with box pews and panelled pulpits, the gallery at Penrhw was inserted later. They are representative of the fact that within 100 years, even the most rural of communities, from one end of Wales to the other, were adhering to a standardised form and plan in building chapels. And although this form and plan in the case of Mae'r and Penrhw was dictated by being conversions, when, as in the case of Nanhoron, custom chapels were built, the style used continued to be this long wall or lateral entry chapel. Long, low buildings, simple in appearance and vernacular in style, it was long thought that these buildings were deliberately reflecting the birthplaces of the causes, the domestic houses and farm buildings, as well as the nonconformist view that worship was part of daily life, integral to every thought and deed, rather than a special activity set aside for Sundays. More recent study, however, has suggested the influence on these early chapel forms comes from further afield, influenced by Protestant church planning in France and the Netherlands via the Scottish Reformed churches. The preference for a building wider than it was deep related to the emphasis nonconformism placed on the oral-based preaching of the word, rather than the more visual focus on ritual ceremony of the Anglican Church. Entry to the buildings is commonly to the outer bays of the facade, a practice which has led to a common belief that it was to do with the segregation of the sexes, men using one door and women the other. There's very little evidence of this, although segregation did occur very early on at a very small number of chapels referenced in documents. It was by no means as widespread as the number of twin doorway chapels might suggest, and it's much more likely that it's an early application of ergonomics and the need to clear a relatively large building quickly after a service. Clear purpose and leaving the centre of the facade free to house either a single or commonly a pair of windows, an important feature in relation to the location of the pulpit internally. This standardised pattern of window and door placement gradually developed into a more strongly defined facade, an expression of nonconformity that started to veer away from the strictly vernacular. This was enhanced with the use of round-headed windows to define the worship space, seen clearly at one of Wales's most iconic chapels, yw'r Mynydd. Here the chapel, which was adapted from an earlier cowhouse, successfully used such windows to advertise the building's new function and to distinguish the chapel from the attached chapel house. Coming into the interiors, they can be seen to be equally simple. The importance of the large central windows for providing valuable light to the central pulpit is evident, and may also have had the desired effect of placing the minister against a bright light, silhouetting him in a dramatic effect and commanding the attention of the congregation. The location of the doors either side of the pulpit rather than to the rear would of course have had the added benefit of making any latecomer walk directly past the pulpit and the minister and in full view of the congregation, making it impossible to sneak in unseen, as well as having the practical effect of making it easier to extend the chapel to the rear as more space was required. The box pews designed to protect the congregations from cold drafts are arranged around the pulpit. The replacement of the central altar with the pulpit, the preacher, and therefore the word, was an integral and fundamental part of the planning of the Nonconformist chapel, as was from an early date the provision of the yw'r, the seated enclosure in front of the pulpit reserved for the elders of the chapel. While simple, the impression is given of substantial and commodious buildings, well lit, well furnished, and often with accompanying stabling. These early chapels no doubt compared well to the local parish churches, particularly in rural areas where reports of their neglect and repair were rife during the 18th and early 19th century, and that many chapels were superior to the local church is more than likely. The later 18th and first half of the 19th century witnessed a dramatic change in the religious nature of Wales, as seen through the figures collected by the 1851 religious census. There are 15 separate revivals recorded in Wales before 1859, including that in Carmarthen in 1828, which added 2,000 to the town's congregations, and the cholera revival of the South Wales valleys in 1849, which is said to have increased congregation numbers by 1,139 in less than 4 months. The 1851 census figures collected were substantial, provoking the comment, "It is clear that the masses in Wales had rejected the established church, and the measure of that rejection was providing themselves with places devoted to alternative forms of worship." Our database records 2,283 chapels built in the years 1800 to 1850, and if the number of chapels recorded as rebuilt in this period is added, another 740 buildings, it can be stated that a chapel building was going up on average every 6 days. Alongside the roughly 1,600 chapels that were built before 1800, it is no wonder that as early as 1811, Richard Fenton was writing, "On my left I pass Bwlch meeting house, but conventicles are almost as numerous over our mountains as tumuli." Put into context, the 1851 census identified 77% of the population as belonging to a dissenting congregation, and only 29% of places of worship in the country as Church of England. During this period of mass rebuilding, there was a radical shift in the form and style of chapels, and in 1861, Rees wrote derisively of these early chapels that they exhibited no architectural taste whatsoever, being plain and sightly buildings more like barns and warehouses than places of worship. Initially, the shift was to a square plan, described as the ideal by John Wesley in terms of allowing all in the chapel to both see and hear. Made popular by larger urban congregations in the Low Countries and English towns in the late 18th century, due to the fact that their form made them easy to scale up or down as required, there are a number in Wales, though by the 1830s they were already considered old-fashioned. Instead, it was the gable entry form which became the preferred form for chapel building, the building style we perhaps most commonly associate with chapels today. This example here at Earlswood Wesleyan Chapel is the earliest gable entry chapel in Wales, recorded at 1791. The model for this form, with most commonly a central entry and a defined architectural facade, was Wesley's City Road Temple of 1778 in London. And this style gained popularity to the fact that, as well as more practically fitting into narrow urban plots that were deeper than they were wide, it externally provided a building that declared itself more distinctively as a place of worship than a house. The tall gable facades could be developed to be more formal, mirroring congregations' corresponding confidence in their self-expression as a place of worship, making their presence felt both to the Anglican Church and to rival denominations. This included the move to emphasising round-headed openings with intersecting tracery to their sash glazing, the addition of simple classical elements to adorn door and window heads, and the heightening of the facade through the provision of upper windows by the now necessary internal galleries and through pediments. These early examples continue to be relatively plain in style, however, due to both lack of money and the fact that many were designed and built by the congregations themselves. As one would expect, many variants exist and facades were tailored to suit the means of individual congregations. Libanus Baptist Chapel, Llansadwrn, Carmarthenshire, built 1841, has a simple facade with just 2 arched windows over the door, although with a very finely decorated galleried interior, while Pendref, Denbigh, at 1802, one of the earliest surviving buildings of this type, has classical detailing to accentuate its function as a place of worship. By the second quarter of the 19th century, however, a sense of architectural design was starting to arrive. Firstly, in the towns where congregations had the money and confidence to start employing professional architects to design their chapels for them. Initially, the classical style of architecture was almost universally favoured, probably in direct opposition to the Gothic style, which was officially approved and used by the Anglican Church. Welsh chapel builders embraced these Greek and Roman forms. However, they didn't seem to feel bound to stick to the historical purity of this style, instead seeing it as an inspiration from which elements could be chosen and mixed as the whim, taste and budget of the congregation required. St James's Chapel, Monmouth, built 1837 for the Wesleyans, is a very fine early example by G.V. Maddox, employing giant Ionic pilasters and a full pediment, while Zion Calvinistic Methodist Chapel, Carmarthen, built 1849 by R.G. Thomas, has a stuccoed classical front with Tuscan pillars. Further to the east, Crane Street Baptist Chapel, Pontypool, by J.H. Langdon, must have been particularly striking for 1847 with its full temple front. While perhaps the most famous of the temple fronters is Peniel Tremadog, built in 1810 as part of the new planned town by William Maddox, entrepreneur and MP, though it seems fairly certain now that the temple front was not added, or at least fully realised, until 1849, post-dating that at Crane Street. The size and execution of the front at Peniel was unprecedented, however. The design, often linked to Inigo Jones's St Paul's in Covent Garden of 1638, although recent research indicates the design may indeed have come from unused plans for a Temple of Neptune Maddox had commissioned from Sir William Gael to be built in Tremadog. Either way, clearly the chapel was expensive to copy, but its use of high classical design helped point the way forward for Welsh chapel planning in North Wales. Internally, the entrances now led to a vestibule from which 2 further doors would lead to an interior space, which better fitted the idea of the chapel as an auditorium, the pulpit at the rear end providing a larger stage for the minister, an extended servare and theatre-style seating and acoustics. One advantage of this form was the provision of 2 long aisles, important once the functions of weddings and baptisms had been added to the preaching services of the chapel, requiring processionals from the doorway to the pulpit. This reorientation allowed for a more enveloping auditorium, one that allowed for the creation of a more intense and theatrical atmosphere. This atmosphere became particularly intense during the National Revival of 1859, an event which started with the return of Humphrey Jones from Wisconsin to his home in the small Ceredigion village of Treddor, but spread through the UK and beyond. The change in preaching from moralistic explanation of Bible texts to an emotional appeal for the redemption of the soul, in part led to the development of the pulpit from the tub type common in Anglican churches to a platform pulpit or dais, which could accommodate the 4 or 5 preachers that could be involved in one of the famous preaching marathons that could accompany a chapel opening or celebration. The 110,000 people it is estimated were added to the congregations by the time the revival burnt out in 1860 also required further and larger chapels to be built between 1859 and 1861 alone. Over 300 chapels were either built or rebuilt to a larger capacity. The second half of the 19th century was also heralded by Wales as the world's first industrial nation, a point at which more people were employed by industry than agriculture, and both of these factors brought about a new phase in chapel building. Focus shifted to the building of urban chapels by wealthier congregations, causing developments in scale and style, as well as the rise of professional chapel architects, in particular those of the great preacher architects. The most famous and most prolific was Thomas of Llandour, Swansea, who is claimed to have been involved with the design of some 800 to 1,000 chapels, and is best known for his trademark feature, the giant pediment arch. Thomas was a minister for the yw'r, the Welsh language independence, and for much of his career designed exclusively for them, designing chapels in the South Wales valleys, Swanseas, and the slate quarrying areas of North West Wales. By 1870, his name was so well known and his work so admired that rich urban congregations, regardless of denomination or language, were vying to have their chapels designed by him. He became one of the very few architects to have his name on the foundation stones of his buildings and to be prominent in the Welsh language newspapers of the day. Richard Owen was one of the few professionally trained chapel designers in Wales, having trained in architecture after moving to Liverpool from his home on the Llyn in his 20s. He is also the architect about whom we know most, his work being uniquely illuminated by a vast collection of letters and chapel design specifications kept in the Liverpool Record Office. Owen designed largely for the Calvinistic Methodists and mostly within the North and Mid Wales regions. Championing a style classified as Lombardic or Lombardic Italianate, a mix of Gothic and Italianate elements, his designs were so popular that in some towns such as Aberystwyth and Llanidloes, up to 4 chapels stand as testament to his place as the second most prolific chapel designer in the country. Regional designers included George Morgan of Carmarthen, also a deacon of his first chapel, the English Baptist Chapel on Lammas Street, Carmarthen, and builder almost exclusively for the Baptist congregations, and Owen Morris Roberts, who, although mainly worked in the northwest, had the distinction of designing the interior of Capel's Llanelli, accepted as one of the finest, if not the finest, in Wales. As the century drew on, the increasing wealth of many congregations, particularly in industrial areas, their ability to commission a professional architect, and the rise of nonconformity to essentially become the established religion of Wales, led to the great showfront chapels which dominate many of our townscapes. These use an eclectic mix of high classical, Italianate and Romanesque elements, which earn them the scorn of the architectural establishment of the day, but perhaps their lack of regard for architectural purity can be seen as a willingness to be as equally nonconformist in architecture as in religion. The pinnacle of this development must be Tabernacle Morriston, built in 1872 at a cost of £18,000 by another great chapel architect, John Humphreys. Described on opening as the one great redeeming feature in that manufacturing district, an oasis in the desert, it is commonly known as the Cathedral of Nonconformity. With its distinctive spire, the design was decided on only after the minister, Emlyn Jones, and John Humphrey had been on a tour of the best chapels Britain had to offer, collecting elements from each to combine the final design for the chapel that was initially called New Libanus. Having emphasised that most congregations used classical architecture, some Gothic chapels were of course built. The earliest Welsh group of Gothic buildings associated with nonconformity are those at Trevecca, Breconshire, where Howell Harris established his Methodist family in 1752, or in the unusual group of church chapels of North Pembrokeshire, built 1799 to 1802 by George Bowing of yw'r, Nevin, to enable Methodist services to be held under the auspices of the Anglican Church. Increasingly from the 1815 onwards, however, the Gothic style began to find favour to varying degrees, with some arguing that it was inappropriate to have religious buildings that were indistinguishable from the architecture of secular concert halls, theatres, or town halls. It is the Wesleyan Methodists, with their continued closer links to the established church, who are regarded as bringing Gothic to Wales via their architect James Wilson of Bath. It was he who in 1850 built the Wesleyan Central Hall, Charles Street, Cardiff, described as the first departure by nonconformists in Wales in building large Gothic structures, and chosen a few years later as the frontispiece for the second of the annual reports of the Wesleyan Chapels Committee that disseminated information on recent chapel buildings. After 1860, we get what has been termed as the Battle of the Styles, a long-held theory that a battle was set out between classical versus Gothic architecture and as Welsh Calvinistic Methodists versus English Wesleyans. And good examples of this division can indeed be found. In Denbigh, one of the best chapel landscapes in Wales, we find Capel Mawr, the Welsh language Calvinistic Methodist chapel, and St Thomas, the English language Wesleyan Methodist chapel, very neatly illustrating this point. Thanks to our database, however, we've been able to start statistically analysing this theory. And if we look at the number of chapels built by both denominations between 1860 and 1930, we can see that numerically the division of architectural styles is relatively unimportant for the Calvinistic Methodists. However, when the use of their styles by denomination are plotted geographically, we can see a clearer pattern of the use of classical chapels, the red dots, and Gothic chapels, the blue dots, becomes very apparent in North Wales, with classical architecture dominating the areas which continue to be a stronghold of the Welsh language, including Anglesey and the Llyn, with Gothic chapels used more freely in the counties of Montgomeryshire and the industrial areas around Wrexham. A strong influence on Wesleyan congregations would have been the appeal put out in 1850 by the Reverend Frederick Jobson via their yearbooks for all Wesleyans to use Gothic for their chapels. If we look at the distribution of styles they are using after this date, we can see a clustering of Gothic chapels in the South Wales valleys and the Vale of Glamorgan, representing the influx of English speakers to the coalfields, while the distribution in North Wales tends to be far more mixed. While there is almost no alteration to the layout of interiors in the second half of the 19th century, they also become increasingly grand in scale and decoration. The size of the reservoir increases in Baptist chapels used to accommodate internal baptism pools, replacing those taking place in pools, rivers and the sea, and space was made, often awkwardly, for the provision of organs on a grand scale. Decoration became increasingly elaborate, although it almost exclusively followed Calvin's doctrine that any visual representation of God was to peddle impious lies, with ornamentation restricted to architectural motifs or those taken from the natural world in the form of leaves and flowers. Painted quotations from biblical texts were encouraged, however, often placed to frame the pulpit and the figure of the ministers. There are a handful of notable exceptions to the standard plan. The first is Bullen near Margam by C.R.M. Talbot of Margam Abbey, and is unique as the only octagonal chapel in Wales, and possibly more influenced by the chapter house of Margam Abbey than by Dutch and English precedents in nonconformist architecture. Ebenezer in Llandudno by the early 20th century architect William Beddoe Rees is similarly the only chapel with a fully round interior, although both Tabernacle in Ruthin and Jerusalem in Bethesda have extended semicircular plans. Some of the 2,200 new chapels built between 1860 and 1900 were due to the increasing need for the provision of separate chapels for English and Welsh language congregations. In Aberystwyth, for example, all 4 of the main denominations rebuilt the chapels for their existing Welsh language denominations on larger and grander scale. But also built separate chapels for the increasing English language worshippers, particularly the influx of English visitors brought annually by the new railway in the summer months. This doubling of provision could be increased further by theological splits occurring within the congregations and the formation of splinter groups. For example, in 1890 at Silo Welsh Calvinistic Methodist Chapel in Aberystwyth, which in itself was already a daughter chapel of Tabernacle Welsh Calvinistic Methodist Chapel in the same town, a disagreement over a detail of biblical interpretation led a substantial number of members forming a breakaway congregation which established Salem Chapel, built some 300 metres along the same road from Silo, although in a contrasting Gothic style to emphasise their departure. Rivalry between denominations would also have played a factor in increasing the size and grandiosity of chapels. In the village of Pennell, Meirionnydd, we find the adjacent Pennell Calvinistic Methodist Chapel and Carmel Independent Chapel. Founded within a few years of each other in the early 19th century, 1809 for the Calvinistic Methodists and 1930 for Carmel, they were each rebuilt twice through the 19th century, getting larger and with grander facades. You suspect in an attempt to outdo each other with the latest styles of architecture. Although of similar size in plan, in the 1905 census, Carmel is recorded as having nearly twice the seating capacity of the Calvinistic Methodist Chapel, which in turn, having been more recently rebuilt using the early Edwardian style, is recorded of being greater value. By 1904, the nonconformists in Wales were essentially no longer not conforming, but were in fact an established factor in all aspects of Wales's communities, their religious beliefs, their social life, their political beliefs, and even in their work through denominations' involvement with the development of trade unions. Membership numbers in the 1905 Royal Commission on the Churches and Other Religious Buildings in Wales gives numbers of 193,000 attending Church of England services, while the combined membership of the nonconformist denominations was 615,000. The seating numbers provided by the same survey, however, have been used to estimate that the number of worshippers that could be accommodated in the chapels was around 1.5 million, indicating that there was some unrealistic optimism of never-ending growth and rivalry, which had led to massive over-provision and unnecessary building. The 1904 to 05 revival was the last national religious awakening within Welsh nonconformity. Estimates of the numbers of new converts are between 90 and 100,000, and despite their over-provision of seating already mentioned, nearly 500 new chapels were built or rebuilt between 1905 and 1914, the majority by the 4 old denominations. However, the nature of the revival were the evangelical conversions of those who witnessed the visible manifestation of the Spirit breaking out into the life stream, which afterwards touched thousands of souls, were often at odds with academic preachers in the pulpits, and were the first signs of decline in traditional nonconformity, with the answer for many to look towards the new Pentecostal denominations. With Pentecostalism growing to become the most ubiquitous expression of global Christianity after Roman Catholicism in the 20th century, many of the large Pentecostal denominations had their origins in Wales. In 1916, Daniel P. Williams founded the Apostolic Church, its original headquarters being just outside Ammanford, while George and Stephen Jeffreys from Nantefellon Maesteg established the Elim Foursquare Gospel Alliance, which in one 12-week campaign in 1929 attracted some 5,000 converts across South Wales. Unlike the earlier denominations, these and other new evangelical denominations initially had little physical effect on the landscape of Wales, preferring to buy chapels that were falling redundant from other denominations. The landscape of 20th century chapels is one that we are just starting to study in earnest, the original project focusing on chapels built until around 1910. In the 20th century, new style of architecture do start to appear in small numbers, and any divide by style, denominationally or by language, disappears. Arts and crafts was reasonably popular amongst all the denominations, with particularly fine examples at Sion Wesleyan Methodist Chapel, Llanrydder y Mochnant, rebuilt 1904 by Shaler and Ridge of Oswestry, and the nearby Herman Calvinistic Methodist Chapel at Cymru, built 2 years later, also as a result of the revival, and possibly by the same architects. At Cymru, Ceredigion, an independent cause founded in 1672, who had built their first chapel in 1737, built their fourth and final incarnation using this style in 1921, designed by the architect J. Harold Morgan of Carmarthen. Art Nouveau went almost ignored by the chapel builders, perhaps the associations of the style being seen as a bit too sensuous and risque for nonconformity. A small number of particularly fine examples of Art Deco facades were designed from the 1910s through to the 1930s, the earliest at Milford Haven, where the 1910 Congregational Chapel combined arts and crafts with more modern elements. Later were two notable brick-built examples in the developing seaside resort of Porthcawl, where Tabernacle Independent was built in 1831 for the rapidly expanding population. Another Baptist chapel was raised in 1939 to specifically provide Welsh language services in the town. In each of these cases, however, these modern exteriors opened up to reveal interiors almost indistinguishable from those of the Victorian designers. Really, however, these were the decades in which the voices of the traditional denominations were starting to fade. Before 1914, the industrial communities which had become the stalwarts of chapel support were suffering. 28,000 miners were starved back to work in North Wales in the Penrhyn Quarry dispute. 1898 had seen the lockout of 100,000 miners in South Wales, while the First World War marked a decisive change in British attitudes to religion. The over-provision of seating that had been provided in the later and first decades of the 20th century meant that between 1918 and 1950, the numbers of new chapels we have recorded numbers only some 228. After the Second World War, some new building did start to increase for a variety of reasons. In the cities of South Wales, rebuilding of chapels destroyed during the bombing raids was required. The preeminent practice of the Percy Thomas Partnership designed chapels at Sketty, Swansea and Heath, Cardiff, with striking modern interiors, although still on a traditional plan. Elsewhere, the large-scale redevelopment of town centres in the 1960s and 1970s involved compulsory purchase orders and rebuilding, with mixed success. In Port Talbot, both Water Street Baptist Chapel and Carmel Calvinistic Methodist Chapel were bought by the town council under CPO, and the congregations given the option of money or replacement buildings. Opting for council-built replacements, the pair of chapels were designed and built by council architect J. Morgan Harris. Appearing not to have been overly familiar with nonconformity, the resulting buildings are interesting, both with twin pulpits, Carmel with a suspiciously crown of thorns looking decoration to the roof, and Riverside Baptist Chapel with an internal baptistry added late in the day when the congregation realised this rather important feature had been overlooked, but sadly with no accompanying plumbing. At Wrexham, a more innovative solution was used by the Wesleyan Methodist Church, who sold their site for the redevelopment of the town centre for shopping, but developed their own space within and above the shopping precinct to remain at the heart of the town. Post-war planning also involved the expansion of existing towns with new suburbs, or even whole new towns such as Apcombe Bran, that required new places of worship. Both the Fairhill and Llanarafon Methodist churches in new neighbourhoods of Cymru were designed to be architecturally prominent as places of worship, proclaiming themselves as centres to help engender a sense of community amongst these new populations. Sandfield's Wesleyan Chapel, Aberafon, also built by the Wesleyan Methodists for a new suburb housing residents brought into work for the Talbot Industries, is representative of a new sense of design and planning was being used for both interior and exterior alike. Conversely, however, much of the new building in the second half of the 20th century by the traditional denominations was taking place due to the reduction in size of congregations and changes in requirements. As membership decreased, congregations would come together, often reuniting causes from mother-daughter chapels or those who had previously split into one building. With a desire to encourage greater community use and accessibility to all, these united congregations frequently decided to sell the stock of existing chapels between them and build one new chapel that was easier to maintain and provided flexible spaces that can be used for a range of community purposes. New Berea Chapel, Glanather, illustrated here, was built in 2002 after the merger, closure and sale of 5 chapels in the Llansannan area. Other building in the later 20th century has come about through the growth of other newer denominations. Particularly successful has been the growth of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a church with its beginnings in the 1830s and which had had a strong early following under Dan Jones in Wales in the middle of the 19th century, but which had gone in decline after the 1960s, with the Welsh Conference closed in 1904 with fewer than 200 members. From 1958, the church re-established itself, however, and the earliest surviving church can be found at Merthyr Tydfil, a striking modernist building opened in 1963 with over 1,500 people in attendance. With some 19 churches now across Wales, the denomination has a very particular process for the design and building of its churches, the size and style for each being determined centrally from US headquarters according to predetermined patterns. This talk is very much focused on the architecture of these buildings, but of course the project has looked to record the fuller histories of Welsh chapels and place them in their religious, social, cultural and educational context. During the 1859 revival, congregational singing became an integral part of worship, encouraged by the production of the Welsh Tonic Solfa manual, which made it possible for more people to read music, and with this soon developed the Great Cymanfaganau singing festival that became hotly contested events with much local rivalry. The choir of Bethania Maesteg, for example, is reputed to have walked over the mountains on Christmas Day, soaked to the skins in the pouring rain, to compete and win the first prize at the Mountain Ash Eisteddfod for singing Worthy is the Lamb, thereby indicating their ultimate commitment. Equally important, of course, were the Eisteddfodau, which had previously tended to take place in the local public house. The capability of the chapel to provide larger and better laid out space for these events had the added benefit of supporting the chapel's temperance movement by divorcing such activities from the provision of alcohol. Frequent concerts and tea parties could also be usefully used to provide funds towards paying off the debt that was left on all but the wealthiest of congregations after building. In 1855, the English Independent Chapel in Merthyr organised a lecture and tea party for which some 2,000 tickets were sold. Education was another extremely important aspect of chapel life, with the provision of libraries, Sunday schools and improvement in debating societies, which as well as teaching literacy would develop communication, debating and musical skills, and could in some cases lead to the building of sizable complexes. Trinity English Wesleyan Chapel in Penarth, for instance, built a schoolroom with a hall, classrooms, primary room and a library. In 1852, it was claimed that over 100,000 children under the age of 15 were being educated by 25 to 30,000 teachers in nonconformist Sunday schools. And by 1883, the schools catered for over 460,000 pupils. Education was not confined to religious matters. The April 1852 issue of y Traethodydd, the monthly periodical, contained the statement that Welshmen went to chapel, in part at least to seek for that which the Englishman goes to the playhouse to look for, with lectures covering a great diversity of subjects from Anne Griffiths, the hymn writer, and geological facts and biblical truths, are they contradictory, to the village blacksmith. In Wales, this of course had the added dimension of providing a continuing platform for the use and teaching of the Welsh language. While the Welsh language had been available since the translation by William Morgan in 1579, it was Reverend Thomas Charles, a Calvinistic Methodist preacher at Bala College, and his formation of the Bible Society, which ensured the widespread printing and distribution of Bibles in the Welsh language. He was also responsible for the 4-volume Adeiladau Hanesyddol, the scriptural dictionary, which sought to explain and enhance an understanding of the Bible. For many, the chapel with its cymanfa bwnc, cyfarfod adloniadol, and associated Welsh language journals such as yw'r, was probably the only platform for the intense spoken and written Welsh at a time when all work and official activities, as well as schooling, took place through the medium of English, and has been ascribed by many as the most important factor in ensuring the survival of the language into the 20th century. Just to finish off this talk, I'm going to briefly highlight the way in which the recording project and the database in particular has allowed us to interrogate the building stock of chapels and some of the statistics that we're able to bring out. Some of this is quite simple. For instance, we can look at the denominations, both in terms of numbers and buildings, clearly showing the bigger number of chapels built by the big 4 denominations. And we can also look at their geographical distributions, here being those of the 6 largest denominations found in Wales. Equally, we can look at the popularity of different architectural styles which are used, and as discussed earlier, we can start to look at the correlation of those styles by denomination and geographical area. Using the 1905 census, we can look at factors such as size, value, and location. So, for instance, here we have the largest and smallest chapels by seating capacity and the chapels with the largest and smallest monetary value. And perhaps we can even start to play around with assessing a cost per seating value to compare chapels in different areas of Wales. So agricultural areas versus industrial areas, seaside towns versus upland areas. One phenomenon which I think is really interesting from the database is that of chapel names. Around 140 different names are recorded if we take into account Welsh and English versions, and nearly 100 of these, including the 10 most commonly used names, are Old Testament names. While these are such names as by no means exclusive to Wales, the use of names such as Tabernacle, Moriah and Bethel is far more prominent here than elsewhere, while conversely the use of names of purely Welsh derivation, such as Capel Bach, Capel Newydd, Hen Gapel, is very low. The majority of Old Testament names are used to relate to geographical features, in particular mountains and bodies of water in the Holy Land, and there are maps of Wales or parts of Wales overlain with that of the Holy Land, cross-referencing such features that would hang in chapel vestries. Certain of the less commonly used names would have had a particular significance for particular denominations or congregations. For instance, the name Ainon, a place to the west of the River Jordan, which was the location for the baptism of John the Baptist, was used exclusively by the Baptists in Wales. While here we have a list of names that are recorded as only being used once by a single congregation who decided it had some particular significance for them. Another important aspect of the data in informing what is happening now with chapel buildings across Wales is the status field. We have collected data on whether the chapel was closed or in use throughout the project. In 2011 to 2012, we carried out as comprehensive a snapshot survey as we could, using volunteers to find out whether chapels were demolished, converted, etc., where we gained information regarding some 4,000 of the chapels on the database. As a result, we were able to look at the buildings by county to see the percentage of chapels still in use, demolished, converted, and lying disused. This is obviously information that changes rapidly with time, and we find it particularly difficult to keep up to date with. And therefore, we are very grateful to the volunteers who help provide us with batches of updates in this regard. And here I must give particular thanks to Rob Schofield and Richard Barrett, his two people who have worked very hard on our behalf on this in recent years. On that note, and with an awareness that I have been speaking for a very long time, and I'm sure that people are getting restless, I will just say that the project started with the invaluable help of many Capel volunteers in the 1980s and is continued with the help of many more. All the chapels on the database are also on Cofline, the Royal Commission's online inventory of sites, while the fuller database is available via the website created by the Commission and Adeiladau Cymru in 2014, which also has many interesting articles about chapels and nonconformity, as well as a series of pages and digital resources created by us in partnership with them, detailing the history of the chapels held in their trust. We are always very grateful for additional information about the chapels, additional photography, and archive material. So for any of you who would like to contribute to this ongoing project, please do contact me.
Gwych, diolch yn fawr iawn, Susan, am sgwrs gynhwysfawr iawn ar datbygiad Pensaernïaeth yn Capeli a'r cynlluniau amrywiol wrth gwrs sydd wedi gweld ar draws Cymru hefyd. Thank you very much, Susan, for a fascinating and detailed talk. It's very interesting, wasn't it, to hear how Welsh chapel architecture developed over time and the various designers and architects involved as well. We don't often think of those involved in the building of these buildings. And of course, it's great to have some data at the end as well. It's great to have some stats always. And I think that comes, doesn't it, from the and highlighting the way the importance of recording our chapels. Without that recording work, we wouldn't have those data either. So diolch yn fawr iawn I ti am hynna. So I hope you all out there have enjoyed the talk as well. The talk will be available for you to listen to again, along with our other Royal Commission talks on our YouTube channel. Should be up then around 2 to 3 weeks. But I can see, Susan, there's quite a few questions coming in. Hopefully be able time to answer a few. I've seen that some have been answered during the talk. So diolch yn fawr iawn I chi, Alan, am eich cwestiwn. A Alwyn, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi hefyd. So let's have a look at some of the questions that haven't been answered in the Q&A then. So the first question from Paul for you, Susan. Are there any recommended architectural history guidebooks to the chapels that lay out the history you have provided today?
Not as many as you might think. There are a few, and I'm sat at my desk, so I have some here. But the very standard sort of go-to book that most people is still Anthony James's Welsh Chapels, the second edition, which was published in 1996, and that's still the sort of the only real book that gives a sort of overview of the history of chapel building and the difference in the styles. There are sort of other books, so you've got D. Hugh Owen's 2 books, The Chapels of Wales and Capeli Cymru, which gives some overviews of sort of gazetteers of chapels in Wales. But since Anthony James's sort of one Welsh chapel book, there hasn't been one book that's brought together sort of the overview. And I suppose that leads on nicely to the fact that as a part of this project, we are hoping sort of to get that sort of overview of the architectural history and the interpretation of our database and all the information that we've gathered from that out in some format, and that might be a publication. If you go to the website www.welshchapels.Cymru, which I had the link for on that last slide. That was the website that we did in conjunction with Adeiladau Cymru, and there's a lot of useful articles on that. So there are short histories outlining each of the dissenting denominations. There are short articles about different architectural styles, about some of the main architects. So there's some bits of information on that as well.
Yeah, certainly worth having a look, isn't it, on that website and on Cofline too. So diolch am y cwestiwn now. Our next question is from Nigel. It's challenging for us today that classical pagan architecture was so readily adopted. Among other reasons, could the notion of classical temples deriving from agricultural buildings such as barns, also the origins of non-conformist buildings, be a factor?
I've not heard that sort of specific link sort of being discussed, but it is sort of a possible sort of, I think one of the things is obviously, I mean, as I sort of mentioned, this idea of Gothic architecture being very strongly associated with sort of the medieval church and the continuance with the Anglican church. So for instance, the Incorporated Church Building Society sort of very much recommended that Gothic architecture was used for the new churches that they were building from the 1840s onwards. So it was very tied in with that idea of the Anglican church. So partly it may, I think it is a reaction against that. The idea of sort of pagan and religious architecture, because obviously with a non-conformist chapel, it's not, the building in the space isn't considered a sacred sort of space in quite the same way that say an Anglican or a Catholic church is. So in terms of having an actual sanctuary which is sacred, that doesn't really appear as a notion in non-conformity. It's about the cause, it's about the congregation, the building is somewhere to house that cause. So I think perhaps this association of a spiritual architecture and a pagan architecture didn't really sort of come in to their thinking in quite the same way that perhaps it does with the sort of more established church. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it made sense to me too, so I'm with it. That's great. There's another question here. Is there a move to safeguard non-conformist burial grounds, especially where the chapels have disappeared and the cemetery still exists?
The same problems do occur with the burial grounds in the same way when the chapels go out of use. Obviously, when the chapel is sold on, there can be some burial ground, if it's around it in the same way it's directly associated with it, often gets sold with it, and it is a difficulty as to what happens to these, and that is one focus. That we have to make sure that those are recorded in the same way that the buildings and associated buildings such as chapel houses and Sunday schools are all recorded, because there's an equal threat to all of these sort of complexes. And obviously in a lot of cases the burial ground is actually located at a distance from the chapel, particularly in towns. They may not be associated, and a lot of those burial grounds sort of do become very uncared for, and so they do need to be recorded in the same way. But there isn't a specific project, and you know, again, without the listing and without that sort of formal protection, again, there's the same difficulties of what happens to them when the chapel closes.
Diolch. There's a comment here from Daniel. He's managing the British Methodist Buildings Photographic Project. But we're keen to talk further about our work. Of course, Daniel, please do get in touch. The same with anybody else who have any questions or would like to find out more. You can email Susan directly through the email she gave at the end of the presentation, or contact us through social media or our website as well. So yeah, do please get in touch. It'd be great to hear from you. Diolch yn fawr iawn I Alwyn hefyd. He's put a few comments up there, sharing a bit more information about different the different chapels. I've seen that Susan have answered one, and another one there about the Baptist chapels in Mold, Pembrokeshire, and in Llangefni hefyd. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi Alwyn am fod yn rhan o drafodaeth. Alan Davies hefyd, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi, a diolch am, dwi'n falch bod chi wedi mwynhau'r sgwrs hefyd. Mae'n gwestiwn ma Susan yn dysgu Cymraeg.
Dwi'n deall, ond I will answer in English, so I won't attempt.
Ydych chi'n gwybod faint o'r capeli sydd wedi'i rhestru a faint ohonyn sydd mewn perygl heddiw?
So in terms of the numbers that are listed, it's just under around 800 chapels. So that's sort of saying we have around just under 6,500 on our database, and just under 800 of those are listed. The majority at grade 2, we have only 5 grade 1 listed chapels in Wales. So that's quite a low number considering that the numbers of the chapels that we have maybe. In terms of those that we know that, as I say, we collect information, and I think there is another question sort of further on as well about tracking what's happening to them. So in terms of the information we collect about the chapels as they exist now, we obviously try and sort of keep up to date with how many are closed, and we do collect information on what happens to those chapels once they have closed. So the statistics, I think you saw on that last slide, we do record whether they've been demolished, whether they're lying disused and empty, or whether they've been converted into something else. And where they've been converted into something else, we keep a record of what they've been converted into. So whether they've been converted into a house, antiques, furniture showrooms and art galleries are quite a popular reuse. Some do get reused as other places of worship. So we do have a number which have been reused as a mosque or Islamic centres. So we do try and keep a record of what happens to these buildings after they've closed as active chapels as well. As I say, that's the information that's quite difficult to keep on track. So if people are happy to let us know if their local chapel closes and what happens to it, then we're always very grateful for that.
Diolch. Ie, a certainly do, then bendant, cysylltwch â ni, chymod, os gennych chi'n rhyw wybodaeth. Dwi'n gweld, Richie, you mentioned as well, if you found something on the database, please do contact us with any sort of updates or anything like that. We'd be really grateful to have that input from you all.
One thing I should mention, sorry, for the fuller database, which is available on the Welsh Chapels website, we have the data entries, and then we do have the ability for people to add their own comments and upload their own photographs. And if you put the information there, that's another way for us to be able to pick that up as well. So
that's great. Yeah, diolch, Susan. Thank you. Isabel, hopefully that Susan's already answered your question there about the information that we have on the database. But if you do need some further information, please do get in touch with us. So diolch am hwnna. Wyn Hughes, question here, is asking about the sidewalls. Was it just for cost savings that the sidewalls are sometimes made in simpler materials than the facade of the chapel?
Yes, I think so. I think bear in mind that these chapels were built by the congregations themselves. This was a group of people who were coming together and they were raising the money to build their own place of worship. Even for denominations such as the Calvinistic Methodist, which had more of a hierarchy, it's still those individual congregations that are coming together. So cost, even in those big grand showfront industrial chapels in the industrial towns, obviously cost was still a consideration. So to be able to focus that money on creating as grand a front as possible, and quite often, yes, behind the scenes things are simpler, and unfortunately this is why sometimes quite often you do get these sort of structural problems, because a lot of the money does go into that sort of show front, and things were perhaps built a little bit more cheaply sort of behind the scenes, but cost is the main factor.
I think it's the same for all us all, isn't it? There's a few more questions still coming in, Susan. Hope you got time to answer a couple more for us. There's a question here from Patricia asking, what happened to the proposed pilgrim route through Wales, looking at chapels and defunct churches? Is this something you can answer and have information?
Well, there's various different projects which have sort of come and gone through the years looking at this, and I've not been involved with sort of all of them. The most recent one has been the Sacred Wells project, which was being run by the National Churches Trust. And that can be found under the sort of Explore Churches umbrella. And that's been running over the last sort of 18 months to 2 years. And that's been creating 3 main routes through Wales, based on the Visit Wales, Explore Wales routes. So the sort of North A55, the A470 and the 485 coastal road. So it's been creating routes of both chapels and churches along those 3 main routeways, and creating working with congregations and chapels and churches to create faith tourism experiences. So that may be in Anglesey working with the green bikes, green lanes, bike sort of exploring tours, to create cycling tours of chapels on Anglesey, to working with individual congregations who might provide sort of particular either sort of spiritual faith tourism experiences or just sort of tours and talks about their chapels. So if you look at Explore Churches and the Sacred Wells, that's one of the most recent projects looking at this. And I do know there have been sort of various other ones, but they do sort of tend to come and go as funding allows and sort of that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, diolch. And I think Visit Wales have a few pilgrim trails on there as well, don't they? It's well worth having a look at them, and hopefully, yeah, now we're able to go out and about and walk again.
Yes.
Great. Isabel's added a couple of other questions as well, Susan, there, about sort of, do you know about any novels you'd recommend maybe to explore about the nonconformist sort of inside the cultural element of it as well, something she can read possibly. I know that she hoping to revisit Wales soon. You can read about it.
Not my area of expertise at all, I'm afraid. So you do have in the early 20th century, so authors such as Kate Roberts, I suppose, would perhaps be the obvious one who writes about sort of that early 20th century Welsh society and sort of chapel society. But I'd probably have to have a little bit more of a think about sort of wider ones than that. That's not my.
Yeah. And she's also asking about, we haven't mentioned the Quakers, etc. this evening, about their influence on Wales, but we do record sort of all kinds of
yes, so we've taken a very broad view of nonconformity in this project. So there's lots of denominations which are on the database, which obviously I couldn't mention every single one. So we do have the Quakers, things like the Moravians, Bible Christians, Christadelphians. So we do cover a very broad sort of remit of all the denominations. The Quakers obviously did have a very early strong influence. So we've got the Pales meeting house in Radnorshire, the cause dating from about the 1860s, the building, I think from about 1741, the first building was built. And that's a beautiful place. If she's coming to Wales to visit, that's definitely somewhere that's on her list to go and see. And then obviously the influence of the Quakers with migration to North America does very much fall off across much of Wales. You get little hotspots such as around Dolgellau, where they continue quite strongly, and then sort of in the 1930s, 1940s, you start to get a bit of a reintroduction, and so a little bit like the Church of the Latter-day Saints, really. but yes, we do cover a whole remit of other denominations that we couldn't cover this evening. So.
Thank you. So we've had one recommendation for a book for you to read here, Isabel. It's Outside the Houses of Val by yw'r Humphreys. So maybe worth having a read of that as well. And there's numerous ones as well, especially the Welsh language, but I'm sure, Isabel, if you're a Welsh speaker as well, or not. The next question then is from Stefan Green. What happens to chapels that are owned by the members rather than the denominations? When the membership falls to zero, is there a formal mechanism for dealing with the legal ownership? Again, is this something within your...
Again, this is one of the those, so for instance, the independent chapels, so that could be the Annie Bunwer, some of the Baptist chapels, which are independent congregations, and some of the other denominations do have some independent, essentially they're owned by that group of people, and once the membership disappears, the chapel essentially has no ownership. So either it's sold privately before that happens, but that there are, we know there are a number of chapels which belong to independent congregations where essentially there's nobody left who owns them, and it can be a problem where somebody actually wants to decide to buy the chapel and perhaps redevelop it, and actually nobody can be found who has the legal ownership of it. So there isn't any formal mechanism to deal with that, and usually that sort of perhaps goes into the hands of the council, where they can put out a call saying, you know, we'll advertise this for so long for somebody to come forward to say that they have an ownership of this site, and if that doesn't happen, then it sort of falls by default into sort of council hands and they can dispose of it. But quite often this is why chapels will just lie completely derelict, and it's not possible to find another repurpose for them because nobody actually knows who owns them and what the legal situation is. So that can be problematic.
Okay. And there's a question here from Phil then. Is it true that especially rural chapels were deliberately built some distance from the village so as to impose an arduous journey on the congregation, you know, that penance to worship?
Oh, not that I've heard. I've not come across that one before. I don't think. Mostly, you know, we have these chapels such as Mynydd, which today looks as though it's in a sort of very, very remote area. And I think sometimes it's, you know, you have to think about the fact that perhaps 200 years ago, so for instance, in the lead mining areas of Ceredigion, which today are sort of very unpopulated and sort of given over to sort of these vast agricultural sort of sheep farming areas, there would have been scattered but, you know, fairly substantial population of people sort of spread out across that area. So sometimes a chapel that looks very remote today and you sort of think, oh, how far would somebody have been travelling to come to this? It's because those upland populations no longer exist, and it's sometimes difficult to remember the fact that there would have been sort of bigger populations that would have used these chapels. But I've not come across the claim that it was done deliberately as a penance for people before now.
Diolch, Susan. O Alwyn, dyd sôn bod ni ambell i gapel yn Sir Fflint hefyd yn heiddi sylw, a felly bod ni wedi cael cyfle heno i sôn amdanyn nhw. Ond diolch i chi, a wrth feddwl am Sir Fflint hefyd, wrth gwrs mae Daniel Owens hefyd yn dydi'n werth i gael. So Isabel, Daniel Owens yn another one.
I could remember Daniel, I couldn't remember the sense.
Yes, yeah. So diolch i chi. There's a few other thank yous as well. Some other suggestions here, Rhys Lewis, Abel Hughes as well, for you to read, Isabel. So plenty of reading for you now, Isabel, there. Right, and a comment here from Chris. Such an important part of Welsh culture certainly is. I'd be good to come back to the subject again, perhaps with a more detailed story of the chapels in some towns or something. So yes, I'm sure, so we can arrange something, can't we, and have another talk at some evening.
A whole series of talks about different aspects.
Yes. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi i ti, Susan, am ateb y cwestiynau yna. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi am y cwestiynau. Thank you for sending in your questions, and thank you, Susan, for answering them as well. As I say, after this evening, you know, if you do want to contact us, please do, you know, either through social media or our website. We have an inquiry form on there, or please do contact Susan directly as well. And we'd be very grateful as well if you could spare us a couple of minutes just to give us some feedback on tonight's talk. There's a link in the short survey in the chat for you there. So byddwn ni'n ddiolchgar iawn i chi am unrhyw adborth am sgwrs heno. Mae dolen i gael yn yr arolwg yn y chat felly. A croeso chi hefyd unrhyw gwestiynau neu sylwadau ar ôl heno, croeso chi gysylltu ni. Bydd ein darlith nesaf, sgwrs gan Medwyn Parry ar awyrlyniau yn cael ei chynnal ar y nos Iau ail ar 20 o'r Orffennaf, heno eto 5 o'r gloch, a bydd yn rhan o'r raglen Gwyl Archeoleg Prydain. Felly croeso chi fynd draw i'n gwefan neu gan manylion llawn am y sgwrs yno, a gobeithio bod chi'n gallu ymuno ni. Our next commissioned talk will be given by Medwyn Parry, and that'll be on Thursday, the 22nd of July at 5 o'clock. And the talk, The View from Above, 100 Years of Aerial Photographs of Wales, will be part of the CBA's Festival of Archaeology. So I do hope you're able to join us. Again, if you do visit our website for full booking details as well. Felly gloi, hoffwn diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd am ymuno ni heno. Diolch yn fawr iawn i holl staff y Comisiwn am drefnu. Ac yn olaf, diolch yn fawr iawn i chi, Susan, am sgwrs diddorol iawn. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. To the Commission staff who have been busy involved with arrangements, and of course to you, Susan, for a fascinating talk. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd. Nos da.